people are filing into our studio audience. Okay, so we're gathered today to honor Laura Robson and the publication of her latest book, The Politics of Mass Violence in the Middle East. This book launch is being sponsored by the History Department at Penn, and it's being recorded and will be available on the History Department's YouTube channel. And you can also follow events occurring in the History Department, sponsored by the History Department, in social media like Twitter and Facebook. So my name is Nina Safran, and I'm your host for the book launch. Our program is to have Laura introduce her book for about 10 minutes, followed by comments from our distinguished panelists who join us from all over, Joel Beinin, Mustafa Aksakal, and Dirk Moses. Then Laura will have a chance to respond to queries and comments by the panelists and develop the conversation a little bit more, and she will entertain questions from you, the audience. If you submit questions through the Q&A panel or site at the bottom of your screen. So let me begin by introducing Laura and our panelists before I let Laura sort of take the podium. So Laura Robson comes to us at Penn State from Portland State University. She made the move in a pandemic and has settled in as best as possible, given the circumstances. She's the William L. and Donna F. Oliver McCourtney Professor in History at Penn State. She's a historian of the modern Middle East who focuses on trans-regional and indeed global topics such as ethnic politics, forced migration, and mass violence. She's already published 2 previous monographs and 2 edited volumes, and her book, The Politics of Mass Violence in the Middle East, is hot off the press from Oxford University Press. Our panelists today are Joel Beinin, who's the Donald J., he is distinguished, but his official title is the Donald J. McLachlan Professor of History and Professor of Middle East History, Emeritus at Stanford University. He's an authority on the social and cultural history and political economy of modern Egypt, Palestine, and Israel, and has written or edited 11 books, most recently, Workers and Thieves, Labor Movements and Popular Uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt. Joining us today also is Mustafa Aksakal, who's an Associate Professor of History and Nesuhi Ertugun Chair of Modern Turkish Studies at Georgetown University. He's the author of The Ottoman Road to War in 1914 And his current research focuses on the social and political history of the First World War in the Middle East. And finally, Dirk Moses is the Frank Porter Graham Distinguished Professor of Global Human Rights History at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. He's published widely on genocide and colonization and has a new book coming out, if I'm correct, titled The Problems of Genocide, Permanent Security, and the Language of Transgression with Cambridge University Press. And in 2020, he also published Decolonization, Self-Determination, and the Rise of Global Human Rights, edited with Roland Burke and Marco Duranti. He's also the editor of the Journal of Genocide Research. So welcome to our panelists, welcome to our audience, and now I'll turn the microphone over to Laura.
Thank you all so much. Thanks to Nina for chairing and to Lior for organizing this. And to the panelists, I really appreciate the opportunity to come together and talk about this. And I suppose it's one of the few advantages of living this content to have people from such widely varied places. So thank you all for attending. So I was asked to just say a few words to kind of introduce the project, to talk a little bit about its scope and content. And it occurred to me that the first thing I should say about this book project is that I really can't legitimately claim it as my idea. The project originated with two European historians whose work some of you are probably familiar with, Donald Bloxham and Mark Levine, who are both scholars of European genocide, and who began the series that this book is part of, which they called Zones of Violence, to address what they saw as a significant problem, some significant problems, and maybe even some kind of major intellectual failings of the field of genocide studies. So to kind of frame this discussion and suggest some of the conversations that this book project came out of, I thought I would start by reading out part of their original proposal for the series of Zones of Violence, which gave voice to some of the critiques of the field that they had and suggested some ways of producing a different kind of scholarship on genocide and its related phenomena. So these are their words about what they were doing here. Quote, genocide studies has created a conceptual trap for itself because of the inbuilt focus on instances that qualify as genocide, either according to strictly legal or somewhat broader social scientific criteria. Indeed, the near obsession with questions of definition in genocide has not only exhausted and often sterile debate the energies of the scholars concerned, it has also served to bolster an implicit moral hierarchy of mass violence in which anything not qualifying as genocide is downplayed. This has had a knock-on effect in terms of historical understanding, with instances of, quote, outright genocide being accorded more attention than other related phenomena, and more importantly, being extracted from historical contexts in which other instances of, quote, lesser violence are intrinsic to the picture. Overall, the focus on genocide as such often equates to a focus on outcomes rather than causes and processes that may or may not produce the fully crystallized crime of total murder. So in other words, what they were suggesting was that the exclusive focus on which cases count as genocide and the kind of hierarchy of violence that that implies has actually seriously limited the analytical capacity of historical work on the broader context and phenomenon of mass violence. And it's also meant, I think, that the genocide studies framework has only kind of rarely been applied in broader transnational geographies. And for instance, this really speaks to this project, that it almost never is brought to bear in conversations about the Middle East, even though mass violence is clearly a defining characteristic of the region's modern history. These are two fields that just have not come together in a meaningful way. And in fact, I would say that this is a divide that actually works both ways. If we have on the one hand the problem that genocide studies hasn't been interested in the Middle East, we also have some real limitations within the field of Middle East studies that have made it hard to imagine a really transnational history that examines mass violence, makes use of it as an analytical category. That's because modern Middle Eastern history has for quite a long time been deeply committed to profoundly nationalist frames of reference. And that's something that's common in all kinds of post-colonial literatures. And it can probably be attributed to a kind of reflexive defense of post-colonial nation states who are indeed facing profound challenges. But it has really kind of prevented scholars from recognizing and exploring trans-regional and transnational themes in the Middle East's modern history. So as I started to think about this book project and the opportunities that it opened up, it seemed like a project that could indeed maybe break open some of the issues and the problems in genocide studies, but also could maybe break apart some of the limitations in the historiography of the Middle East. And particularly, I will say, this project seemed to me to offer a way to think in a more integrative way about Israel-Palestine, which is so often treated as something totally separate from the rest of the region, totally different, totally distinct. So it was an attractive kind of opportunity for me to think about these questions. And it was an opportunity that I hoped would have something to offer the field of Middle East studies, as well as fulfilling the original promise of rethinking the limitations of a kind of genocide-oriented analytical frame. So that's kind of the story of the origin of the project. And I thought I would also just try to give you a quick overview, a quick sense of what I think the most important broad conclusions of the book are, and how I think they might begin to shift and change how historians think about both the phenomenon of mass violence and about the modern history of the Mashriq. So I think in its broad sweep, this book is intended to challenge how we think about empire in the Middle East. And it's particularly about how the experience of modern empire through the kind of long 20th century installed state-sanctioned violence, and particularly ethnically or communally oriented violence, at the heart of practices of state governance in ways that have proven to be very difficult to reverse. So the first time this happens, I argue in the book, is in the late Ottoman Empire, when the Ottoman government was forced by various European threats that we're familiar with to try to take tighter control over its territory. And this is kind of the beginning of the end for what had been a relatively loose and locally flexible rule that had mostly, not entirely, but mostly characterized earlier forms of the Ottoman state. And it necessarily involved the use of force as a way of asserting a kind of newly visible form of state authority. And because of the nature of those European interventions, those earlier European interventions, which had a pattern of identifying client communities who were mostly Christian as venues for political and economic and military intervention, this Ottoman firmer approach to territory started to display a more vigorously ethnographic understanding of governance. So we have in this late Ottoman period kind of three strands: local ethnic politics, European intervention, and forcible state control over territory that came together in this late 19th, early 20th century realm to produce a situation where Ottoman state power against other states was exercised internally, A, through force, and B, with an eye to kind of ethno-communal difference. So the book argues that this is kind of where the stage is set for a fairly specific and actually very toxic relationship between the premise of state government and the use of ethnically aware violence. Then we have the European colonial period, which begins at the end of the First World War and ends, depending on where we are, in the 1940s and 1950s. And this is actually a period too, for which the concept of mass violence is very useful, because historiographies of genocide, and for that matter, historiographies of empire or of the Middle East, have never, ever recognized just how brutal European colonialism in the Middle East really was. And it's funny, right? Because questions of colonial violence and genocide have come up in other contexts. It's been discussed for Australia, for North America, for other places. But historians really have not come to terms with the fundamentally bloody nature of the so-called mandate system. And between the 1920s and the 1940s, the British and French colonial states engaged in truly astonishing levels of violence against civilians all over the Middle East. They bombed villages in Iraq, they leveled the entire old city of Damascus, executed and assassinated intellectual and political leaders, bulldozed neighborhoods, murdered women and children. And all of this violence was accompanied by schemes that rigorously and violently segregated populations by ethnicity and by language and by religion. So I think that partly because the British and French did all of this while claiming that they were training these populations for future democratic self-determination, we really haven't internalized the kind of level of destruction of these colonial occupations. We haven't tried to relate it either to the violence that was simultaneously unfolding in Europe or to colonial violence elsewhere. We haven't seen it as part of a broader pattern of mass violence that is closely related, I think, to the genocidal impulses of late European imperial politics. And instead, we've had a tendency to view it as something particular to the Middle East, and especially particular to the Zionist Arab conflict that is building in Palestine. So another one of my major takeaways from this part of the book is that we need to recognize the incredible brutality of this interwar occupation. We need to understand it as a crucial part of the global mass destruction that characterizes this period more generally. And we need to see it as a moment of the more or less permanent installation of the idea that viable state governance rested on displays of force, and the more brutal, the better. And finally, the last sections of the book suggest that we need a reconsideration of the whole of the post-1945 period in the Middle East, which is an era in which both authoritarian and semi-democratic governments across the region, we don't have any real democracies in this period, engaged in massive arms acquisition and then deployed many and maybe even most of these weapons against sections of their own populations. Typically, this era has been seen as kind of an era of first violent decolonization and then an equally violent post-colonial descent into either authoritarianism or kind of fractured and incomplete forms of democracy. And that's, of course, a pattern that we see in other spaces in the world as well. But actually, I think when we look through this lens of mass violence, we can see something else. We can see that there are many ways in which this isn't a period of decolonization at all. It's a period of recolonization. It's a recalibration, a recasting of empire into new shapes in which superpowers control spaces by combining a new kind of economic dominance with a deliberate flooding of weaponry into the relevant territory, alongside careful and sometimes not very careful creation of specific ethnic or communal client populations. And in truth, one of my conclusions from this project has been that I actually don't think it's too much to say that when we look at the hard realities of power, the Middle East today, in some ways, is as colonized as it's ever been, and that mass violence has been crucial to that enterprise of recolonization, both as a practical strategy and as a kind of political legitimization. So those are kind of my own takeaways from this book project. And of course, they're very far from the last word on the subject. And really, above all, I'm kind of hoping that this book can open up new kinds of conversations and bring together different scholars working in different fields whose ideas haven't cross-pollinated much until now. So I'm especially glad to be introducing it in an event that's conceived as exactly such a conversation between fields, and looking forward to hearing all of your thoughts and questions. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Laura. Joel, would you like to get us started with your perspective on Laura's work?
Sure. So First of all, thank you, Laura, and thank you, Lior, for inviting me, and to Penn State for organizing this event. Let me first express my appreciation for the book. It's really quite broad in sweep and does, I think, compel a serious rethinking of some issues about which we really need to invest some new intellectual energy. It's based on very broad reading in secondary sources. The footnotes are a treasure trove that I've mined myself for my own project. So in addition to the broad thesis that Laura just laid out, I would point to a few things that struck me in reading the book. First, that it is the European powers who are overwhelmingly responsible for the lack of democracy in the region. And that is because off the map of the book, the British and the Russians repressed the Iranian constitutional revolution of 1905. The British also repressed the first stirrings of democracy in Egypt. And then on the map of the book, the French suppression of the effort to construct an Arab kingdom centered in Damascus, the British, entire British mandate period in Palestine is an exercise in anti-democracy. And then post-1945, the various US and British involvements in coups in Syria and also in Iraq. So this is very important to underline when we think about what's wrong with the Middle East, that a lot of it has to do with the West. Second, oil is integrated into this book in a way that is unusual in most modern histories of the region. Usually oil is thought of as some technical topic that is off to the side and it's too difficult for normal people to understand, even many scholars, so we don't talk about it. But this book in a lot of ways puts oil in the center because Laura argues that one of the principal purposes for British interest in the region was oil. And in the early period, that centers on the province of Mosul, which became part of 20th century Iraq. So I have a specific question about that because according to the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the French were supposed to get Mosul. And then all the discussions of what happened with Mosul focus around this meeting between the Prime Minister Lloyd George of England and George Clemenceau of France in London in December of 19. There's no written record apparently of what they said, but Laura has a kind of soft formulation that basically Clemenceau agreed to give up French claims on Mosul in exchange for a 25% cut of the Mosul oil. So I would like to know if we can actually have a more solid notion of what happened there. Oil is also linked to what I think Laura properly calls the non-exceptionality of Palestine, because oil becomes a very important reason for the British presence in Palestine, both with the construction of the Kirkuk-Haifa pipeline in 1935 and the oil refinery in Haifa, and then that oil position is further buttressed by the military centrality of Palestine from the Italo-Abyssinian War of 1935-36, and the Haifa being an important shipping point for oil and logistical supplies for military purposes. So while I think that is absolutely correct and central, for the 1930s. I'm not sure where that leaves us for the immediate post-World War I and 1920s period, where, of course, the British knew there was oil in Mosul, but there wasn't a pipeline and there wasn't a refinery in Haifa. And it's not so clear that British military considerations were playing as much of a role in policy formations. Then I want to raise some things that I have questions and mild disagreements about. So I've discussed this with Laura several times because I've been familiar with this project from a very early stage on. And that's about the exclusion of Egypt from the Mashreq. So there are, of course, many different ways of defining geographies, and no particular way is absolutely correct for sure. But excluding Egypt from the Mashreq, I think, raises some or eliminates some challenges which might otherwise be raised to the thesis of the book, because Egypt has a different trajectory than Greater Syria and Mesopotamia, which became Iraq, because there is no debate about the borders of Egypt. And there is really no debate about the ethnic composition of Egypt. Yes, there are Nubians and there are Sinai Bedouin and Imazighen inhabitants of the Western oases, but these are very, very small number of people, and they play hardly any role in Egyptian politics, at least until the construction of the Aswan High Dam, when the territories of the Nubians were flooded. So the whole dynamic that is particularly evident in Iraq, of the struggle over who is really an Iraqi and where the borders are going to be, that doesn't happen in Egypt at all. Nonetheless, the Egyptian government did use state violence against its citizens, as the other states in the region did. Not so much during the period of 1922, 1952, when Egypt was a constitutional monarchy under British supervision, but very much in the Nasser period, when political opponents of the state, communists, Muslim Brothers, and even liberals were jailed and tortured on a very large scale. Sadat apparently didn't systematically torture his political opponents, but Hosni Mubarak and Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the current president of Egypt, certainly did. So that's one point of discussion, perhaps. The second is the way Islamism is treated. And there's a very categorical statement on page 145. Islamism was previously utterly marginal to Mashriqi politics. So excluding Egypt makes that a much easier statement to make, because of course from 1928 on, there is the Muslim Brothers in Egypt, and they are a very important political actor. And then I wonder what we then make of Al-Hajj Amin al-Husseini in Palestine, who doesn't come up much in the book. I mean, he was the titular leader of the Palestinian national movement. He began his career as someone who was prepared to go along with the British, but from the Western Wall Barak uprising of 1920, he participated in the radicalization of the Palestinian movement and until he fled Palestine when he was being chased by the British in 1937. So certainly that that imparts an Islamic flavor to the Palestinian national movement. And perhaps even more so, Izzuddin al-Qassam, who I think gets a sentence or two in the book, who led a very important movement of workers and peasants in the Haifa area, which was entirely organized on an Islamic basis against both British imperialism and Zionist settlement. So that question, I think, deserves a little bit of discussion. Finally, there is the question of what we make of fascist style political organizations. So the traditional way of dealing with them, let's say beginning with P.J. Batikiotis, was to say, oh, well, the Arabs embraced Nazi or Italian style fascism because the enemy of my enemy is my friend, or even for more pernicious anti-Semitic reasons. And scholars have backed away from that kind of categorical assessment and noted that, yeah, there was a lot of fascist style politics in the Arab region, but there was also Zionist fascist style politics, which certainly couldn't have been based on anti-Semitism, but was based in some circles on admiration for Mussolini, certainly not Hitler. And then you have a figure like Antoun Saada and the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, which looks like a Nazi party. I mean, it has all the ideological and symbological accoutrements. And then Antoun Saada writes this thing criticizing Nazism as an ideology. But as far as I can judge, it's kind of, he is practicing it nonetheless. And then there's the Phalange in Lebanon. And the most problematic, I think, is what we make of the pro-German elements in Iraq. To what extent are they ideologically pro-Nazi? To what extent are they simply ultra anti-British? And to what extent are they just acting out of tactical considerations of the moment? So I'll stop there to leave Laura and others lots of time to give answers to those questions. And thank you all once again.
Thank you, Joel, for stimulating further interest in the book and our discussion that will follow. Mustafa, would you like to go next?
Sure, happy to. Thanks so much. First thing first, Laura, congratulations on a terrific book and really a tremendous scholarly achievement. This is a wide-ranging piece of scholarship with important implications and an analytical framework really to help us think about violence in the Eastern Mediterranean region from the 19th century to the present in a much broader, more coherent manner. I see your book working together with other recent important works, such as those by Elizabeth Thompson and Leila Parsons, to mention just two. This morning, here in Washington, D.C., I woke up to a report on National Public Radio, to a story describing the lives of Yazidi families returning to their homes in northern Iraq, to the towns and region of Sinjar. These are the families that were driven out in great violence, brutally, in 2014 by the so-called Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, in what observers have now also referred to as genocide. The way that story was told on the radio really reminded me and really drove home the fact of how much we need works like yours, Laura. The report on the radio was gut-wrenching, disturbing, elicited a great deal of sympathy, sympathy and empathy. And in that sense, on that level, I suppose it succeeded with listeners, the audience, who I think felt very connected to the events and moved by what they were hearing about. But it may come for little surprise that the story was completely devoid of any explanation of the historical causes behind these events, whether long-term or short-term, and let alone, of course, any mention of any US complicity or involvement in the making of those very events. What listeners were left with as a result, something I don't think the well-meaning folk at NPR meant to do at all, was a feeling and the sense that the Middle East is a space of tragic proportions, a mess of ethnic and religious violence and chaos without a history, and entangled to some extent beyond examination and explanation. And your book, Laura, of course, is the opposite to that effect. Instead, you've given us a clear-eyed analysis of the external and material aspects to the history of mass violence in the Middle East. And it is crucial, I think, that in your book, you connect the history of the Middle East to that of the rest of the world. Early in chapter 6, I think it is, you say, as in so many other instances across the 20th century, ethnic and sectarian hatreds arose from experiences of brutality, not the other way around. And you show readers how the delineating of external interests in the pursuit of geopolitical objectives and raw materials was facilitated by territorializing ethnic and religious belonging in a brutal manner and often with deadly consequences. And this process was, of course, by no means unique to the Middle East. And so I'm hearing you also say that Middle East history can only be understood in a global and comparative frame, even if, of course, we need to work out the particularities of what happened in the Middle East first. But the deeper history is revealed only in its wider context. And this means, especially in the context of the global South and its dynamic with the extractive and coercive projects of the global North. And in fact, this means that by the 1980s or so, and certainly down to today, we have been left with the Middle East and an Eastern Mediterranean region, and I include Turkey here and Armenia and Azerbaijan and the Balkans, in which ethnicity and nationhood, religious affiliation, all have become almost primarily defined by and through the experience of violence, in which groups are brutally, forcefully, and often unwillingly smashed into their respective circle of identity. The history of the 20th century in the Middle East can, of course, be a story that is exceedingly dark and grim. It's not rare, unusual that in my modern Middle East survey, at some point in the semester, a student will inquire about any cheerful episodes of Middle East history, usually wondering whether there were any. Perhaps not cheerful, but I do see in your book, Laura, glimmers of hope also. As you go through for the reader, the many instances in your book in which first colonial powers and authoritarian rulers of the region and then after 45, Cold War superpowers, you go through the ways in which they sought to pit different ethnic or religious groups against each other. But you also show that there often was resistance to that kind of external manipulation, to those attempts of divide and rule. And that is something that, that gives me hope, I think. I'll go ahead and conclude here, perhaps by noting that we may not be able to change necessarily the tenor on NPR and the media generally all that much, let alone, sadly, the making of foreign policy. Certainly historians in Washington, DC have no power, I can say that much. I do think we owe it to our students and to anyone who's willing to listen to offer them a better history, a longer and a broader and a global history of mass violence in the Middle East in the way you have done it here in your wonderful book, Laura, and have raised the bar for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mustafa, for further illuminating the virtues of the book. Dirk, would you like to join us?
Sure. I hope you can hear and see me.
Yes, there's a
very
little
good
feedback, but
okay. 1 second. Okay, I'm here as the non-Middle East expert because I'm not the Middle East expert. I guess I'm the mass violence guy. The connection with Laura goes back to her participation in a book forum in the journal that I edit, the Journal of Genocide Research, which you mentioned. It's a book by 2 Israeli scholars on the Armenian genocide, in which she wrote a rather exacting review, which I'm sure the authors didn't enjoy. And I saw, Laura is not a scholar to be trifled with. She brought enormous intellectual power, a range of reading and perspectives to the table, which I don't think these authors were expecting. So I was delighted to see A, the publication of this book, and B, the invitation to help launch it. It's a great honor to appear with the others in this panel as well. Now, those of you who have not read the book won't know that she commences it by engaging in an equally exacting critique of the field of genocide studies, which I'm in. And it's a very necessary one. And it does reflect those sentiments she started with in her presentation today about the definitional fetish of genocide, meaning that you screen out other sorts of violence and you focus on outcomes instead of processes. So I think her book is a very good fit in the Zones of Violence one, edited by Mark Levine and Donald Bloxham. Now, I've been working with Mark and Donald for many years, decades actually. And in fact, Donald and I are about to send off a book, an anthology on genocide key themes for Oxford in the next week or two. So we're in close touch. And reading Laura's book today reminded me of the intellectual journey that we've all been going on, partly inspired by Mark Levine's article from 1998, it's already that long ago, in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, which is of course a journal unlikely to be read by Middle East scholars. And the article is called Creating a Modern Zone of Genocide, the Impact of Nation and State Formation on Eastern Anatolia, 1878 to 1923. So it starts with the Eastern Crisis, which is also where Donald Bloxham starts his book on the Armenian genocide, published in 2005, called The Great Game of Genocide, Imperialism, Nationalism, and the Destruction of the Ottoman Armenians. And then followed up with an anthology on the Great Unweaving of Europe, the unweaving of it, coexisting multi-ethnic pluralist regions. Now, what I just want to add to Laura's eloquent explanation of the purpose of the book series is the following. The intuition here in this style of scholarship, which is very, very English actually, not American. It comes from the English tradition of international history, but here with an anti-imperial touch rather than its old-fashioned pro-imperial one. Its intuition is that you can't explain genocides or mass violence within societies through endogenous factors only. You have to bring in exogenous ones, namely the imperial politicization of client minorities, in this case in the Ottoman Empire, which poisons the local coexistence, because secessionist or separatist national minority movements are encouraged by outside empires for various commercial and geopolitical purposes. And that's the dynamic that really needs to be looked at. Now, Laura's book is very good on this dynamic, I think, and she does, of course, do so in rejecting the national primordialism of those national movements which have come to dominate the region. So her approach will not be welcomed by those victorious nationalist movements. I mean, she's going behind them to see what the conditions of possibility were for their very existence. I see here points of contact with scholarship in Africa. For example, Mahmoud Mamdani's point in many publications of the way colonialism posited two types of political identities, one the native and the non-native, the indigenous and non-indigenous, which has poisoned post-colonial states ever since. And also in the Indian context, Chris Bailey's talk of enumerated identities, the way the British census solidified and institutionalized a separate Muslim minority political identity, which then became autotelic and led to the partition of India ultimately. Now, in her zone, Mashriq, or Bilad al-Sham, Greater Syria, broadly defined, Laura posits a dynamic which she calls dystopian politics of identity, which disrupted the rich texture of Ottoman sociability in a number of ways. One was to split Arabs from Ottoman Turks, whereas they were part of a broader Ottoman family until the First World War. And then also within localities, the distinction between Muslims and Christians, between Shia and Sunni, between Armenians and others. And in this dystopian politics of identity, politics is no longer articulated in terms of the region and notwithstanding its own pluralism, but in terms of seeking and gaining, by whatever means necessary, state control or control of the state in the name of an ethnos of some kind, so which then either has to assimilate difference or expel it in violent ways. And she shows how colonial penetration of this region led to catastrophic learning processes on the parts of various elites in which they decided to engage on these very destructive processes. It's very interesting to see how this dialectic is so productive as well as destructive. It's in the wreckage of Ottoman sociability that new identities come into play, these nationalist ones that we're talking about now. For example, the new Palestinian identity that comes out of the refugee camps after '48, which is shorn of the notable class that was running Palestinian politics until then. She shows how the mandate regimes, the French and the British in particular, well, those two only in Syria and in Palestine, in destroying Ottoman sociability, created conditions for the production of new types of politics, which are mainly illiberal, because the pseudo-liberalism of the Western empires was discredited, and it could be either communist, fascist, or Islamist. Interestingly, you see this playing out in Indonesia in the 1940s as well. Now, I think it's a very important point to recall why it was impossible for self-determination, which was the political language of the time, to be articulated for, say, a region with its own identity based on distinct sociabilities, dialects, foodways, commercial links, and so forth. These multiple connections which knitted together a region beyond religious affiliation. So in other words, Christians and Jews in Europe living in one space, as in the Middle East, well, I think of the historian at Stockholm University, Raz Siegel, who's written about Hungary in the first half of the 20th century. He had some lovely essays about sub-Carpathian Rus as a viable region, multi-ethnic region, with its own distinct identity, which was unstitched by the penetration of nationalist paramilitaries and so forth, which forced people to take sides at various times of conflict. Now, another point I'd like to highlight is of this book is its Edward Saadian inspiration. I was inspired to read myself, to go back to his question of Palestine, this book from 1979, in which he says the following on pages 146 and 47. It must be said that the militant minorities in the Near East have almost always been aggressors against what Hurani called the universality, the self-confidence, and the sense of responsibility of Sunni, that is, majority Islam. And here he's thinking, of course, of Lebanon and Palestine. And he continues, when minority consciousness allies itself to a habit of ambitious political generalization, and when those two together are forced into the unique sovereignty of political statehood, trouble in the form of divisive separatism usually ensures. Here I'm also thinking of the terrific book by Nicholas Demanis, published a few years ago, called Before the Nation State, Muslim-Christian Coexistence and Its Destruction in Late Ottoman Anatolia, which tells a similar story a little further east than from the subject of Laura's book. Now, what Laura's book shows, and also Nick Demanis' book, is that nationalism or sectarian identities, which destroy the sociability which was pluralistic, was brought to villages, the interior, by outsiders, by middle-class reformers, by paramilitaries, and so forth. We also see this in the Habsburg Empire. Peter Judson's book, The Guardians of the Nations, all at the same time, mind you, shows how in very multilingual rural regions, where people would actually settle their child in the neighbor's house so they could learn another language, because they were primarily German speakers or Slovenian or what have you. It was school teachers who came to the village or the small town and insisted that people pick one as their primary language, and that would then also class for the census, because funding from Vienna was contingent on it. Now, while we may be nostalgic about all this, about the pre-nationalist identities, it is important to realize that Zionists like Raphael Lemkin, the Jewish lawyer from Poland who invented the concept of genocide, in his early angry young man phase in the 1920s, when he was only in his 20s, thought that multilingualism was a major problem because it sapped vital national consciousness. He thought people, like many in the period, thought that people needed to be emplaced and territorialized, and that multilingualism, to use the term of art today, was a form of rootless globalism. This is something that I think is worth reflecting on. Now, some specific questions. In the introduction, Laura makes a great point of saying that the suffering of civilians, or their object as victims of policy, is a central point of the book in this dystopian politics of identity. But I'm wondering whether it really is, because most of the evidence is really about paramilitary and former military conflict. Now, certainly the civilians are the objects of it, but not only them, it's the other paramilitaries or militaries. So, when we think of Uğur Umut's new book on paramilitarism, which is focused in the same region and in Anatolia, I'm wondering whether there could be greater reflection on that form of informal, irregular warfare. Second question, how distinctive is the pattern that you're identifying? It looks rather similar in Central and Eastern Europe in the same period. In the large swathe of territory that runs between the Baltic and the Black Sea, and variously it's a shadow zone, I think Donald Bloxham coined that term, the bloodlands, the rimlands, these were the borderlands of four Eurasian empires, the German, Russian empires in the north, the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the middle, and in the south, the Ottoman empires abutting at the bottom with the small Balkan states like Greece and Bulgaria. And the Russian in the Caucasus to the east. Now, these empires, which comprise many peoples with contending nationalist factions, collapsed at the end of the First World War, and the resulting bids for state power were predictably chaotic in retrospect. Although contemporaries could not foresee the extent and intensity of the carnage, it's important to remind ourselves about it. Between 1917 and 1920 alone, Europe experienced 27 violent transfers of powers and overlapping and interlocking social revolutions, national counter-revolutions and civil wars, often accompanied by border conflict. And in total, 4 million people died in these conflicts, which were driven by a new political logic, genocidal intent to exterminate ethnic or class enemies. That's very important because of the Bolshevik Revolution. As civilians rather than as soldiers became legitimate targets. And in many ways, these parts of Europe were the most dangerous places on the planet until the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923. Thirdly, I was wondering if you could tell us about your decisions about scale and scope. You've gone really broad and very long, so a rather large region over the long 20th century. But other editorial or analytical choices could be made when I think of Robert Gerbart's book, The Vanquished, which is equally panoramic in its continental sweep, but focuses on 6 years only, 1917 to 1923, in these rimlands of Europe, which allows him to go into a great level of granular detail and exposition, which allows him to link, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Finland in one chapter. Of course, his book is a lot longer than yours. If you were to go into this kind of narrative detail, if you like, that you've resisted here, your digestible 200-page book would become an indigestible one of 600 pages. And there the danger is that the reader loses sight of the woods for the trees. Fourthly, on page 53, here I'm going to become granular myself, you write that the imperial politics of pluralist non-representation and the social coexistence it has engendered for centuries were, for all intents and purposes, gone forever by the time of the peace negotiations in 1919. And I'm wondering, was that the case? It was remarkably persistent, at least for another 10 years in Palestine. Palestinian notables, I understand, did not seek an independent state for Palestine in the 1920s, but continued to argue for its submersion in a greater Syria, without, of course, renouncing Palestine as a meaningful region for them. And they didn't seek to expel all Jews. Of course, they did distinguish between the native and non-native Jews, the settlers who'd just come, and indigenous Palestinian Jews, a la Mamdani. Now, after 1929, with the Hebron, that began to change very dramatically, of course. In any event, it didn't seem to disappear overnight in 19. Which brings us to my last question in the present day. In the epilogue to Avi Shlaim and Eugene Rogan's terrific book on the 1948 Wars for Palestine, Edward Said has quite a scorching essay about the post-colonial Arab states and the way they treat their own civilians. And here I was also reminded of the Syrian dissident intellectual's work, that of Yassin El-Hash Saleh, who in a number of, I regard as quite stunning essays, theorizes the Assad regime, of which he's a refugee and a victim, as a genocratic regime, as in genocide, and as one that's engaged in its own dystopian identity politics. And he likes to call out its lie that its raison d'etre is the protection of minorities. And I'd like to quote him. It's a somewhat long quote, but I think it's worthwhile. He argues, and now these are his words, that the temptation to give the Syrian regime credit for protecting minorities must be refuted and resisted. The truth is rather the opposite. The regime's top priority is to protect itself using minorities as a shield. The entire minority versus majority narrative in Syria is one that the regime carefully crafted long before the uprisings of 211 began, indeed since the 1970s. It fashioned this narrative on a platform inherited from colonial powers, which goes to your point, of course, which had earlier cast themselves as protectors of minorities throughout the Levant. To understand the possibilities for a better future in Syria, activists and analysts need to unshackle themselves from the false narratives and fears of inevitable minority persecution. This is not an easy task, but the cycles of violence and repression in Syria will continue until its politics confront a very basic truth. What Syria needs is not a politics of minority protection, but a civil and economic rights for all based on citizenship, neither enhanced nor restricted by the diverse identity markers bequeathed from the colonizers and invigorated by the Assad regime. And my final word now is about Lebanon. Do we hear this seed of hope from the young people who are on the streets who are chanting, the people want the fall of the regime, all of them means all of them, which I understand is an anti-sectarian chant. This is a generation that's had enough of the elites divide and rule, politics of wasta and client state patronage, and is seeking to enact the program that Yassin El-Saleh proposes there, and that indeed I see Laura's book as providing the historical license for. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Laura, I see you have taken notes, the city of slate, and I'm sure you have a lot to say, so now's your opportunity to respond to all these interesting questions and comments.
First of all, thank you all so much. These are really thoughtful reflections and questions, and sort of exactly the kinds of conversations that that I've been hoping to open up in writing this book. So I really appreciate your engagement with the text. I don't think I'll be able to respond to everything, but I'll take a stab at some things. Both Dirk and Joel talked a little bit about the question of scope of the book in a couple of different ways, and I think I'd like to start by talking a little bit about the exclusion of Egypt, which is something we've talked about before, right? And I think that, so there are a couple of things that I want to say. This book's explicit scope was intended to be the Mashriq, sort of minus Egypt, which is quite often included in considerations of the Mashriq. And I think that there are kind of historical reasons to think about the Mashriq minus Egypt as a space that has operated as a political region across this long 20th century and arguably even before, right? And that one of the goals of the book, as I was kind of setting the scope and thinking about, where it would begin and end, I had extensive conversations with Mark and Donald about the starting point, for instance, about, what would be an appropriate moment to begin. I think that one of the things that I really wanted to highlight was the way that Palestine is a part of the story and not an exception to the story, right? And so I think that in conceiving of it, one of the ways that we can really see that very clearly is by recognizing that there is this kind of greater Syria plus Mesopotamia region that has had a political life that is identifiable from the Ottoman era onward all the way through the 20th century, and that Egypt represents an exception to that in some fairly important ways, right? It has set borders. Its history under the Ottomans is different, right? It has a different kind of structure of governance, a different relationship with the Ottoman state all the way through the 19th century and even earlier. It also has a different relationship with European colonialism because it doesn't fall under the mandate system, because it is a distinct an early colonial enterprise for both the French and the British in the Middle East. I do think that there are ways in which some of the themes that I highlight for the rest of the Mashriq are also applicable in Egypt. I'm not entirely sure that ethnic politics is as irrelevant as Joel is suggesting. Not to just to push back a little bit. I think, the British are obsessed, for instance, with the Coptic question in Egypt. It comes up over and over and over again. They model their Coptic policy in Egypt on similar divisions between Hindus and Muslims in India. There are clear parallels with the India office kind of practices of, for instance, setting franchises in colonial settings for Egypt. And it continues to be an issue. I mean, even Joel himself has written about the ways in which the question of Coptic politics in contemporary Egypt comes to be a kind of indirect reflection on things that cannot be said about Egyptian Jews, right? And about the Egyptian Jewish experience across the course of the 20th century. So I think that actually, even though we don't see quite the same levels of, for instance, population engineering, we don't see obviously the kind of settler colonialism that happens in Palestine, or the, movement of refugees that happens in Lebanon and Syria and Iraq. But we do see there is an ethnic element, right, to politics in Egypt. And in fact, arguments about ongoing ongoing British involvement in the Egyptian economy are actually explicitly predicated on this idea of the protection of minorities in Egypt after 1919. So I do think so even though I didn't include it, I do actually think that there are some confluences, and that does help to explain some of these manifestations of state violence that we see in the Nasser era, for instance, right? That there are some parallels there. And I think I want to also kind of talk a little bit about this question of fascism and why fascism becomes such a central element of post-1945 kind of Cold War politics across the Arab world. And I think this actually speaks to something that Mustafa said as well, which is that there are resonances with Elizabeth Thompson's new work here, and that I think we need to recognize one of the major under-recognized truths about the atrocities of the Mandate era is the way it permanently delegitimized the cause of liberal democracy and liberal kind of forms of representation across the region, right? It was just, I think that by the time we get to the period of post-colonial formation in the 1950s, kind of across the Arab world, these are societies that have been wrecked by the experience of European colonial occupation, while being told that this is in the name of liberal democracy building across the globe, right? And so I think one thing that's happened is that the alternatives have disappeared, right? The alternatives for thinking about politics in a representational way seem not just hypocritical, but fundamentally non-viable, right? Fundamentally violent, fundamentally, false, fundamentally weak. And so this is something that people have not, I think, examined enough about the rise of fascism in the Middle East. And it's kind of, and there are certainly many, many instances of this, right? It becomes a very important organizing principle from Iraq to Syria to, there are many, many examples. And I think that part of it may well be about enemies of empire, the shared forms of acrimony against the British and the French, admiration for figures like Mussolini, if not necessarily Hitler. But I think that a lot of it does also have to do with the delegitimization of the alternatives, and the ways in which this seems like a forceful strike back at these kind of decades of empire, and a way to build in a society where civil institutions have largely been destroyed by the experience of colonial occupation, right? It's something that you can start from the ground up. It is in some ways an easier form of political organizing to undertake. So I think that that's arguably a global pattern as well, right? I mean, this is also something that is not kind of specific to the Middle East. And Haj Amin al-Husseini is an opportunist, right, in a lot of respects. And I think that one of the notable things about his appeals to Islamism is how ineffective they are, actually. His Islamic Congress that he tries to call in Jerusalem is largely a failure. He tries to appeal to Muslims in India and can't really get that off the ground. So it's not a successful enterprise in that era of the early 1930s. I think Qassam is something a bit different, that he in fact does have an emotional appeal to a large portion of the population, but he is not a purveyor of a form of Islamism that has a vision for statehood, right? His Islamism takes the form of recruitment. It's making use of clerical and kind of community centers to bring people into an organization, but it's not a political vision for an Islamic state in some kind of meaningful way. That's something that really doesn't come up anywhere in the Mashriq until much later, even in Egypt, I mean, I think the Muslim Brotherhood is the closest thing we have to that, but it is also not entirely, it's not presenting a kind of entirely developed vision of what the state should look like until a bit later as well. So even in Egypt, I think that that's kind of a gradual process, I would say. Okay, so I think that I'll try to keep my comments relatively short here so that we can have some other questions as well. But I want to pick up on Mustafa's comment about the centrality of the global context. And this is something that I really think is important here, right? That we have this idea that violence in the Middle East, and actually it speaks to some of Dirk's comments about the way that genocide studies operates as a field, that it can be explained through the social factors of the place itself and its populations, right? And I think that once we start using these broader analytical lenses, it's possible to see patterns of empire, of decolonization, of post-colonial violence that extend well beyond the Middle East, and where the Middle East is really just one example of many, right? And I think this is also true of Palestine, and that this is one of the reasons that the Middle East has been regarded for so long as so profoundly exceptional, is because we have been unwilling as historians to recognize that the case of Palestine has parallels, has relationships, is not a sui generis case at all, right? That in fact, there are many, many ways in which Palestine fits very clearly into the global history of empire, decolonization, and post-colonial violence. And I think that that's maybe a partial explanation for how we have come to think, how NPR has come to think of the Middle East as an exceptional space. And it's something that historians have been very slow to object to, right? That from all points of the political spectrum, I think there are many, many people who have had a strong interest in claiming that Palestine is an exceptional case. I hope we can start to understand that it's not, right? That it is, of course, there are local specificities and particularities, but this is something that I often tell my students. One of the reasons Palestine is interesting is because it compresses all of the themes of 20th century history into this one tiny space, right? It is relevant to everything else that is happening globally with the breakdown of the empires and what follows them. So I think that's a particularly important point to stress, and one that I hope we can continue a conversation around. And finally, I would love to think about this question of how distinctive this experience of imperial breakdown is. I think that, it's one of the great kind of unanswered questions of 20th century history. Is it possible to imagine a different kind of political organizing principle that isn't the nation state, right? Could we imagine a post-Ottoman, a post-Habsburg, a post-Russian imperial space that would have been functional, pluralistic, that would have, valued these traditions of multilingualism, for instance, that we now look back on with some nostalgia? I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it's a crucial one for us to consider, because as we get into, the third decade now of the 21st century, it's clear how toxic national politics is, right? And that's true for the Middle East, it's true for the United States, it's true for the rest of the world. So as historians, I do think this is a question that we have some responsibility to think about, right? What are the alternatives? Are there paths not taken that hold some kind of promise for thinking about what an alternative to the nation state era, which has been so violent and so destructive across the globe, what could those alternatives be? So I think I'll close there, and I'm happy to take other questions. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Laura. So if anyone has any questions that are pertinent to the book and the conversation around the book, you may submit those questions to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So far, I only have a thank you for the great discussion. suspect people will have questions once they pick up the book and get into it. Do any of our panelists want to respond to anything Laura said just now? I have a question. Laura, would Middle Eastern literature from the 1920s and 30s, such as short stories, poetry, and so on, add much to your analysis?
I think it would. I mean, I think that it's a good question. I think that in a way, you know, that's the, perhaps we could think of those as the sorts of sources that can point us towards a, you know, paths not taken, right? It's interesting because on the one hand, the 1920s and 1930s are a period where we have the growth of kind of professional classes and, you know, middle class points of contact across the Maastricht that offer, you know, it's a ferment of ideas in a lot of kind of promising ways, and that really is shut down in some pretty dramatic ways by the time we get into the late 1930s. So even though, you know, it's funny, I was thinking about this question of whether the possibilities for social coexistence are actually closed down by the time the peace negotiations open. I think they are in a practical way because the European powers have decided that they have already determined that the shape of colonial occupation in the Middle East will be through the nation state and through kind of violent production of the nation state. But there are ways in which subjects of that occupation are not necessarily quite yet aware of that, right? And so the 1920s is a period where we see popular expressions of kind of the possibility of another global contract and those kinds of literary.
Laura, your audio is fading.
Is it?
At least for me, it was.
Okay. I think those sources might well be a good way of getting into those.
So more expressions of gratitude for the discussion, but so far, no more questions. Dirk's got his.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Very good. The question is, I did get a sense that Laura pushed very hard on the point that local separatist or national liberation movements within the Ottoman Empire were merely creatures of European great power meddling. I'm wondering whether that underplays the autonomous and authentic strivings of nationalist groups on the ground, whether Bulgarian, Macedonian, Arab, what have you, who certainly were encouraged by signals and arms and money from abroad, but have their own local sources of dynamism, motivation, and so forth.
Well, I think that I would say a couple of things. I mean, Mustafa might actually have something. Can you hear me?
No, I can't hear you at all.
Any better?
I think, Dirk, if you mute your audio, that'll take some interference out of the way.
Is that any better at all?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So I think Mustafa might have some more insights into this since he's the Ottomanist in the room. But I think a couple of things. I think one is that we need to make a distinction between kinds of social and political identities that we see arising in these late Ottoman spheres, which are distinct and real, but not necessarily nationalist, right? That we can make a distinction between community identifications that may well, in fact, in this period, do often begin to push back against Ottoman rule, often for local reasons, right? But those, the reality of those social movements does not necessarily mean that they are nationalist, right? So I think that there's a history to be written about the process. And in fact, I mean, lots of Ottomanists are doing this now. There's a history to be written about the process of movement from these kinds of organic social identities to a specific identification with a nationalist cause. And I do think that that can only happen in this context of external participation in the conversation, right? And it happens in a context of violence. So I think that it's crucial, in fact, that we don't really see those nationalist identities emerging until we have a context of violence, and that's an important backdrop for understanding how that process unfolds. I think in the Arab world too, I mean, there are certainly people who are interested in Arab politics, Arab identities, kind of the idea of Arabism, right, in the late 19th century forward. But there are many ways that can be related to the Ottoman project, right? And that's not necessarily a separatist way. It's possible to be a separatist way, but it's also possible to think about those movements as operating within Ottomanism, right? And actually, I mean, there's some ways in which this also happens in the European context. If we look at the disintegration of the French Empire in places like West Africa, for instance, sometimes those nationalist movements, those kind of, anti-colonial movements are asking for a different kind of participation within empire rather than a separation from it, right? So I'm not sure we can think about, I guess I'm not sure there is such a thing as authentic separatist nationalism. I'm not sure what that would mean. I think that, there's not, it doesn't, we can acknowledge, I mean, these things are all real, right? I mean, even, once things that are thoroughly inspired by violent European interventions are nevertheless real. This is the fundamental problem of sectarianism in the Middle East today, right? That nobody is arguing that it doesn't exist now, right? And but in order to kind of think about it in more sophisticated ways, we need to acknowledge that there are points where it arises and there are reasons that it arises in particular contexts at particular times. So I think that's kind of the fine-grained work that historians need to be doing, and that to suggest that, it might undermine the authenticity of these kinds of nationalisms suggests that, there's such a thing as non-authentic political identifications, right? Which is, I think, not the direction we want to head in.
All right, I've got another question. And then I heard something, a peep. So the question is, what about local nationalism entrepreneurs, in quotations, who make their own political, economic, and patriarchal hay out of the exogenous divide and rule dynamic, similar to, say, Slobodan Milosevic in the 1980s Balkans?
Yeah. I mean, again, I think it's part of our valorization of the nation state that we assume that there are legitimate, deeply felt, viable commitments to nationalism and, kind of hypocritical profiteering forms of nationalism, right? Those are all, everything is part of the same too. I mean, I think that we can acknowledge the existence of those things and also acknowledge that there can be, deeply felt commitments to particular forms of nation state identity. None of that means that these phenomena are less real or less legitimate to the extent that anything is legitimate, right? I think that the same is true. I mean, you could make the same argument about imperial possession, right? That there are those who
you know, would swear up and down that it is for the benefit of the subject populations, right? And that is also a part of the narrative, the rhetoric, the kind of, you know, development of empire. I think that, you know, motive is variable, inconstant in all of these phenomena.
So I think maybe this discussion about nations and nationalism can be inflected in a slightly different way. For example, Carol Hakim, in her book on the emergence of the idea of Lebanon, I think that's what it's called, she notes that there were actually two lines. There were Lebanese who did think that Lebanon should be united with Syria, and there were Lebanese who thought that the border should just be Mount Lebanon, and there were ultimately those who went along with the French idea of Greater Lebanon. So because of the famine and the locusts in Lebanon and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, there was going to be some kind of Lebanese national something or other. But it was the French who were decisive in determining what it was going to be, and with all of its problems, which still persist. Same thing in Palestine. There were indigenous Jews who thought of themselves as Ottoman Zionists, and they imagined some kind of Jewish national home within the context of the Ottoman Empire, which was totally not what European Zionists wanted. But even many European Zionists, according to some recent scholarship, were not at all clear that there was going to be a separate Jewish state until rather late on in the middle of World War II, even some would argue. So there were all kinds of national possibilities around, but I think too many people by the time of World War I identified nationalism as an essential element of modernity for it to just be wiped off the agenda of possibilities.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I also think that, you know, one of the ways that nationalism was identified as a crucial element of modernity was at the peace talks, where, you know, it was determined that not just for the Middle East, but for the globe, that this would be the central political institution of the modern era, and that nothing else would be allowed, right? And so I think that that has international support. You know, they're not wrong about that, right? If you think about the fate of movements like the continued movement for a greater Syria, or the fate of movements that envisioned some kind of other form of political organization, they don't succeed because they don't have the backing of any kind of international recognition. So, I mean, I think that there are very real paths of power that we have to kind of trace nationalism through, right? And when people choose one path over another, they're doing so within the context of, you know, a frame of political authority at both the local and the national and the international levels that is real and enforceable, right? And so part of what I think maybe we need to get back to is to think about, what does that authority look like? And often recognize that, in fact, the thing that gives it power is its backing with force or the threat of force.
Thank you. I think we could conclude on that note. I want to thank our panelists for joining us today and participating in this stimulating conversation and launch of Laura's book, and thank Laura for introducing us to her book and stimulating our interest in exploring it further with her in person and through the pages of her book. So thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.